So as we're in the final month before Final Fantasy XVI releases, Square Enix just released a launch trailer for the game. The trailer's dubbed Salvation, and it was shown at the Sony PlayStation Showcase. This is the 5th in a line of trailers, 2 of which I've covered on this channel, that explore different facets of the game for us all to see and judge. For this video in particular, since it shows so much, and it's been so long since I've done one of these reviews, I'm going to go scene by scene and talk about the voice lines in the trailer, and then connecting these scenes back to my previous theories and videos. So if you're new to this channel, I delve pretty deep into what most would consider spoiler territory. If this is the first video of mine that you've seen, you can stick around and maybe you'll get more context as to what we're shown in the trailer. But I will frequently refer back to my old story videos, which you can find on my channel, where I have already discussed a lot of the things we're going to see in this video. So if you want more context, you can go check those out. I'll generally refer to them by name once I get to a topic that's related to it, and I might even give a little notification in the upper right that you can click on, but you don't have to. So anyway, now that with the disclaimers out of the way, let's dive in. We open with a wide shot looking at a path heading towards the Crystalline Dominion. We can see that all the characters in frame are heading towards the Dominion, which makes me think about the PAX event where we overheard people trying to flock to the Dominion after Drake's Fang had been destroyed. You see, the Crystalline Dominion is one of the last locations with a Mother Crystal, so it's receiving a lot of refugees from areas where Mother Crystals have been destroyed by us. So chances are these are just a bunch of refugees fleeing to the Crystalline Dominion under the light of the moon. Which brings up something else I've wanted to mention. Again, the main theme song for this game is titled Moon Gazing, and if you've been following this channel, you know that the moon and the little red star just so happens to be in frame a lot in the marketing material. So I do want to reiterate, the moon is 100% going to be important in some way. I'm almost positive. Definitely in a symbolic way, and potentially in a more tangible way. We then cut to a quick shot of Clive with a hood on going through what looks like a bazaar in Dhalmekia. Nothing can really be seen in the surroundings, but it does confirm some of my thoughts I had early on in my videos where obviously Clive, after defecting, is a wanted man and feels the need to try to hide his identity when in high population places. This is actually one of the facts that I used very early on to predict that the hideaway would be in that central mountain with the Blight. We then see some branded people talking to what is most likely a Dhalmekian soldier. From the looks of it, the soldiers are looking for information, possibly on Clive or Cid's resistance faction. Obviously, the soldiers don't think much of the branded and have no issues using force to get what they want, or even just for the fun of it. I think the thing that I immediately noticed when looking at the scene is that this is where we fought the Republican War Panther in the PAX East gameplay footage. You'll remember in that state of play, I mentioned that there's a bunch of dead bodies on the ground, and I think we're probably looking at them. Looking back at it, a lot of the bodies look like the soldiers in the background here, but unfortunately, I think some of the branded probably won't make it out either. Also, if you remember, I was a little confused as Clive was level 16 in the footage. Now, we don't know how accurate this is, but if that is the case, this would be happening very early on, like right after the Garuda Benedicta fight. Again, that would surprise me quite a bit, though since they're showing so much of it here, maybe that is somewhat accurate. Anyway, getting back to the trailer, we then see a lady who's talking to Clive in what must be after the War Panther fight. She's basically saying to Clive that they never asked to be saved. Chances are this is one of the first examples of Clive trying to do the right thing, but having unintended negative consequences, as Clive killing these soldiers will probably ruin these branded's lives, since they'll all be suspect of rebelling. The trailer then cuts to a scene which to me seems potentially very spoilery. We see a bunch of Dhalmekians killing some civilians in what appears to be some fallen ruins. Now, the thing is, my brain immediately thinks of Cid's hideaway. Then, if we think back to the main theme video that I did, we established that it's fairly likely that the hideaway will eventually be destroyed and will move our base of operations. So with this in mind, I immediately think that this might be the cutscene of Cid's hideaway being invaded. It's of course possible that this may be some separate branded encampment in some ruins, but even then, I'd imagine that they'd still be linked to Cid. The next scene is one that I find pretty interesting too. In this scene, we see Clive crying on his knees as he sees Rosaria, his home, burning. Now, I think that this is actually super interesting for one main reason. Look at the banners on the gatehouse. You'll notice that they're actually Rosarian banners. You can see them here in the intro footage we saw in the state of play. However, you'll also recall that Rosaria is actually invaded by both the Iron Kingdom and the Empire. And at this point in time, in the present, with older Clive, the Empire should be controlling Rosaria. In fact, if I take you back to the PAX East panel footage, we can see that the Empire actually has its banner on the gatehouse in this scene. So that begs the question, what's going on here? Well, I think the obvious thing is, as I've talked about before, this is likely a cutscene that leads into the Ifrit versus Ifrit fight. As you can see, it takes place in front of the Rosaria and everything in the background's on fire. As I've said before, I'm almost positive that this fight takes place outside of reality. maybe within Clive's mind or something like that. And after this fight is when I think we'll unlock our limit break and gain more control over Ifrit. So this scene of Rosaria burning, I actually don't think is real, and most likely was put in the trailer as a red herring. We then cut to a quick scene of the intro of the Fafnir fight, who is the end boss for this forest stage. If you've looked at the recent press demos, you've probably seen a lot about this fight, as it was the last main boss fight that they all did. Then, at the end of this fight, we hear a voiceover of Jill and Clive saying that the crystals take more than they give, with Clive being shocked at the news. Now, I think it's interesting that they have Jill explain this concept, or at least it seems like it based on the tone of her voice. My guess is the Iron Kingdom actually knows this fact, and maybe their hate for the dominance stems from this knowledge. Also, for some people, this might have been a huge lore bomb, but if you've been following this channel, you'd know that the JP website outed that this was the main goal of the game months ago. But yes, this game's main objective for the majority of the game will be to destroy all the mother crystals as they're sucking the life out of the planet. Also, while this is going on, there's a couple more fight scenes. We see Clive using an Odin slash on some men in the same arena where we saw the Republican War Panther. And as I stated earlier, these are likely the men that we saw abusing the Branded at the start of the trailer. Then we see Clive using a Bahamut finisher on some giant and what appears to be Dhalmekia. I'll just put a reminder here that you shouldn't trust the iconic abilities you see for any gauge of how far into the story we are, as I'm almost positive they have a save file with all of the icons unlocked so they can show off abilities earlier into the game to avoid spoilers. Levels I've found are generally accurate, icons are almost never. There's also a few quick cuts showing a giant Morble, which is a little different than the tutorial one, an Iron Giant, which I think we've seen before on an elevator fight in some Fallen Ruins, and a Behemoth, which is obviously in Waloed as we see the Mother Crystal in the background. We then cut to a branded Clive and Jill in some ruins, which is presumably the hideaway, talking to Sid, who says, if they won't give us a say, we'll decide our fates another way. If you remember in my main theme video, the first scene in that video, we saw Clive stabbing a knife into a crystal laying on a table, and that crystal already had a knife in it. I had said that it was likely that Sid and Clive were agreeing to destroy the mother crystals together, and stabbing the knives into the crystal would have been a very symbolic way to do an oath. If you look at the dagger in Sid's hand in this scene, it actually matches the dagger which was already stabbed into the crystal on the table. So I think that this scene and context pretty much confirms that. While the voiceover is still going, we also see Sid walking up to the blue mother crystal that we've seen many times at this point. This time though, we see Sid walking up to the crystal, draw his sword, and strike the crystal, an attempt to destroy the mother crystal. Again, going back to the music video, remember that we saw Sid laying on the ground smoking with blood on his chin. So I think this scene doesn't really bode well for what's about to happen. My guess is that for some reason Sid can't destroy the Mother Crystal. This is actually pretty interesting for a reason that we'll see later on in this video. The other thing I want to say that's super interesting is I'm currently debating if this is the Crystalline Dominion or Sambrique. The surrounding water and the blue crystals made us all think it's the Dominion, but as we all know, the Crystalline Dominion crystal isn't destroyed until deep into the game. And I've already established in previous videos that this is happening fairly early on as Clive still has his brand. So either the party retreats after Sid fails to destroy the Mother Crystal, or this whole time this was actually Sambrique's Mother Crystal. We've also known that Sambrique loses their Mother Crystal fairly early on in the story, as I'll explain later on in this video. Anyway, we then cut to a couple fight scenes between Hugo and Benedicta, who they've shown off quite a bit, and I've mostly given my thoughts on by now. The next scene though is a rare look at Dion, who is also doing the voiceover for the section. Dion says, "Tell me true. Do you believe that what I'm about to do is wrong?" If we go way back to the Dominus trailer, I remember thinking back then that based on this scene, Dion would be a conflicted character. He seemed to me like a character that takes actions according to his duty, but often wonders if he's doing the right thing. And I think this voice line basically helps to support that idea. We know that we'll fight Dion at the Crystalline Dominion, but personally I believe there's a decent chance that Dion is actually a good person and may end up as an ally to us after our confrontation. Also, I have to say I do love me some Jargoon jumps. We then cut to a Jill section of the trailer where Jill says, "I was forced to kill. You do it by choice." I've heard some theories saying she might be talking to Clive, but I think it's a bit early to say that. This is really just her reference back to her time as she was slave of the Iron Kingdom, which is something we've discussed before. This scene, however, is new. Looking at, we'll see that Jill is making an ice tunnel, and actually, if we look here, Torgal is also with her. Now, I think the really interesting thing is that we see what looks like a waterfall in the background, plus I might be crazy, but these look like masts and sails of some ships. Given the look of the landscape too, I'm almost positive that this scene is taking place on the bottom of the ocean, where in just a couple of scenes, we'll see that Clive is fighting Barnabus. I'll talk more about it there. Joshua then starts talking about how people don't believe in him as a person, but rather in him as the dominant Phoenix. It's a little imposter syndrome, but Also probably mostly true. Nothing really new to see here. We've known Joshua has healing powers for a while, but it does give some insight into Joshua's personality. Then we cut to Sid sitting in a window saying, "You can't blame a man for wanting to bring an end to all this, can you?" My guess is he's likely talking about destroying all the mother crystals and how on a larger scale, he doesn't really care about destroying society, as from his perspective, as someone who saves branded people, he believes society itself is flawed. So tearing it all down and building it anew doesn't sound so bad to him. Also, this building he's sitting in, I think might be the church where we saw Clive, Jill, and Sid looking out at the Imperial Capital, as seen here. There's also a quick scene of Sid being cool and finishing off Fafnir with a snap of his fingers and some lightning power. Then we have Barnabus who says, "Never led astray by your blind resolve," followed by, "And thus the light of hope is severed," as he slices Clive across the chest. Now this was a big scene for me, as we knew that Barnabus was for some reason at the bottom of the ocean, but I had always assumed this was just some plot thread that was running parallel to the main plot. So for example, I thought that maybe Clive would destroy Mothercrystal, and then there would be a meanwhile screen, and we would see Barnabus walking on the bottom of the ocean, and we'd be thinking, well, what the hell's going on? Now though, however, we know that he fights Clive, Jill, and Torgal in this location. My guess is, based on the fact that Clive is sliced across the chest here, this might be one of our first run-ins with Barnabus, and I think it'll be a scripted loss where we're forced to retreat and Barnabus gets what he wants at the bottom of the ocean. I can't really draw too much more from the scene, other than the fact that I get the feeling that Barnabus sees himself as someone greater than Clive, maybe someone who knows more about how the world works and has come to a different conclusion than Clive on the best way to move forward. The following line is actually probably the main line of the trailer, as if you look in the video description, you'll see it written out. And the line contains the title of the trailer. Clive says, "We don't need your salvation. We'll save ourselves, and we'll do it on our own terms." I think it's really hard to say who exactly Clive is talking to in the scene. My guess would either be the true endgame boss, who is likely a godlike figure, or maybe one of the major antagonists like the Emperor or Barnabas. My guess, based on the context clues in the trailer, is this might be something Empire related, because as Clive is saying this line, we actually see Clive opening a couple of doors, and when the doors are completely open, you'll see there's a couple of Imperial banners located on either side of him. Truthfully, I don't know if I can really place this scene, but given the sections of the game where they tend to show gameplay footage, I think this is likely Clive opening up the throne room in Rosaria. Here, I think we'll find and fight Hugo for the first time. In the next scene, we see Clive's hand burning with his glove off, and in the background, it looks like some fallen ruin. I think this is again a bit of a bait and switch, as the scene where we see Clive actually turning into Ifrit looks to me like the Typhon fight, and if you remember, in the Typhon fight, there weren't really any walls, which there are definitely some walls behind Clive here. Another thing I'll say is they've done a lot of cuts with this voice line, all with different scenes, which makes me think that they're probably cutting around certain spoilers they don't want us to see. We then have a montage of a bunch of different dominants while Barnabas explains what the dominants are, with some slightly different wording than what he said in the dominants trailer. Here he says, "We are but mighty acts of God." It's hard to know how much Barnabas knows about the world, but I do think he could literally be right here, as the Eikons are relics of the fallen, who when compared to this current civilization are basically gods, or something like that. Or for all I know, maybe there really are gods in this world. But time will tell, and I feel like with Final Fantasy, it's usually a little more complicated than that. There's definitely gods, but they usually aren't just gods for the sakes of gods. They're usually some alien or ancient race or manifestation of human hope or something like that. The next scene isn't all that interesting, as it's a reused Benedicta voice line and footage, but this is followed by a new Hugo line. Hugo says, "We shared a dream. I would be the king of the world." I actually find this Hugo line interesting for two reasons. When I first heard it in the trailer, I thought he was speaking to Benedicta, because we learned through the second round of press previews that just came out that Benedicta actually was sleeping with Hugo, and it was very likely that Hugo would confide his dreams with Benedicta, and that Benedicta, being a spy and seductress, would nod her head along and say that she would support him. This was basically confirmed in the JP in French version, where Hugo outright says Benedicta's name when he's saying this line. So I'm glad my gut was right on for that one. The second interesting thing is the king of the world bit of the quote. I had long wondered what Hugo's motivations may be, but based on this quote, we basically know now that Hugo just aims to use his strength to dominate the world. A very classic and simple motivation, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. I'm looking forward to some more characterization of him once we get to play the game. The next scene is a fight between Ifrit and Bahamut on the flower, which we've seen a few times now. So the scene itself isn't that interesting, but we also hear Dion saying, "Darkness has taken hold of you, it's made you forget yourself." Again, this is playing into the fact that Dion wants to do the right thing and is often confused on on what the right thing might be. He does seem to have a moral compass in what is right and wrong. That said, I think it's hard to say who he's talking to. Some people have theorized it might be Clive, since this trailer seems to have a greater focus on Clive, but given that we just had Hugo talking to Benedicta in the last scene, I think it could just as likely be the Emperor who has just given some ridiculous order to Dion, and maybe Dion's questioning him. So that's the most I'll say on that for now. The next shot is a scene of Shiva firing off some ice missiles while Jill says, "I don't want to be a monster, Clive." Here, obviously she's talking to Clive, and my guess is based on the sentence, she is maybe objecting to something Clive suggested, saying that she doesn't want to become a monster in order to achieve their goal, or something like that. I think this might be a little taste of Jill acting like Clive's moral compass along this journey, making sure that Clive doesn't lose himself and his morals. Then we have a Phoenix and Ifrit fight from the end of the intro while Joshua says, "I have to stop him, I have to save him." I think this quote is fairly straightforward. This might be some inner monologue as Joshua transforms into Phoenix and he's talking about stopping Ifrit to save his friends and family. We then see Ifrit powering his spirit bomb up again, which takes place during the Typhon fight as we've seen before. The interesting thing here is that Clive says, "I made a promise to my friends, and it is they who will give me the strength to end your reign." Here I think Clive could be talking to Barnabus, the Emperor, or the gods, though I think Barnabus is the most likely. The interesting thing to me though is it's very much a power of friendship line, which I absolutely love and is basically a Final Fantasy staple at this point. We then have a very quick shot of a crystal popping out of the ground, followed by another quick shot of a giant flower over the city, and the flower almost looks CG rendered. I think both of these scenes are somewhere in the Crystalline Dominion, as I've talked about before in my main theme video. The thing I'm wondering is if we're seeing the rebirth of a Mother Crystal. Maybe we succeed in destroying the Dominion's Mother Crystal only for this new one to be reborn. This is also obviously where we'll fight Dion as Bahamut, as we saw earlier in this very trailer. We then see a scene of Ifrit fighting Odin, and Barnabas says, "Your efforts will avail us not." Fight scene isn't that interesting, and I think for the quote, he's obviously talking to Clive. Again, this just hammers home the idea that Barnabas seemingly knows more than Clive and doesn't agree with how Clive is approaching things, thinking that what he's doing is pointless. So now the following section cuts from scene to scene extremely quickly, so I'm going to pick out scenes that are new and I think are interesting. First though, Clive has a voiceover in this whole section that says, "We fight, we survive, we endure. We don't need a reason." And besides sounding badass, I do have trouble placing who exactly he could be talking to here as well. It very much sounds like he's talking to some godly being or a being who believes he's above humanity, and Clive is maybe speaking on behalf of all human. We've heard lines like this spoken in Final Fantasy XIV, but honestly, I could be totally off base with that. Anyway, let's get to the quick scenes. The first one that is interesting to me is this scene of what I think might be Phoenix flying at a bunch of mega flares. The framing of the shot is super interesting though, as the backdrop is the night sky with a super bright moon. Again, we're seeing a huge focus being put on the moon in these random scenes. The other thing that I've seen people say about the scene is they say, "Look, we're going to space." I just wanted to say that this is almost certainly happening above the Crystalline Dominion. Just the framing of the camera makes it look like a space battle. You'll remember we've seen a Phoenix Bahamut fight taking place over the Dominion in the State of Play. Then there's a rare shot of Barnabas outside of his armor. The reason I stopped on this frame is just because when you look at the background, it looks like he might be in Dhalmekia based on the architecture. I've already established that I believe that Waloed invades Dhalmekia after we kill Hugo, but this helps support it and confirms that Barnabas is even there. We then see what looks like a giant blade coming out of a portal, and as many people have noticed, the symbol on the portal looks like Odin's symbol that we see during the Zantetsuken. So this is likely one of Odin's powers. Based on the look, I think it's some sort of spear, which is obviously on brand for Odin. Just, I don't know if this is Odin's spear, or if it's just some giant spear that's going to fall from the sky and kill a bunch of people. It's hard to tell since there's really no frame of reference, but it is pretty cool. So that's the end of that quick section. There's then another quick section with a bunch of people saying Clive, and I'm going to stop on this one scene of Clive with blood on his face with no brand in Dhalmekia. The lack of brand places this later in the game. My guess is this might be around the same time Barnabas invades Dhalmekia, and we must have killed someone or something. After this collection of really quick scenes, we see a close-up of Clive's face right before he cuts through Drake's Breath Mothercrystal. Interestingly, we've seen this scene before of the close-up of Clive's face, as this was the first time that I had theorized that Clive might be missing his brand, and that's a good way to tell where we are in the story. This was also when I theorized that Clive would lose his brand at the volcano, so if this isn't just some fancy editing, which it could be, then by the time we destroy the Mothercrystal, Clive has lost his brand. The other interesting thing is, if you remember, earlier on we talked about the possibility of Cid trying to cut and destroy that Mothercrystal, and potentially failing based on the fact that we see him on the ground in the main theme video. Well, here we clearly see that Clive is slicing through no problem. So I do wonder if there's something special about Clive that allows him to destroy Mothercrystals where others can't. Or maybe it's just the fact that Cid's a dominant of Ramuh, and so maybe just the normal dominants can't destroy the Mothercrystal. We don't really know where Ifrit comes in with all this, but we do know he's not part of the traditional 7 or maybe 8 if Leviathan's in dominance. But after the scene, the camera actually zooms out and we see a book closing with the title popping up. This is actually the second time we've seen this book, as we saw it in the Ambition trailer, where we now know that Vivian was narrating. Vivian, we know, is the tactical historian, so that can make sense, especially given how that trailer spoke of events happening in certain years, like they were all in the past. Hey guys, Future Thalwig here. I was editing this and I realized that I missed something really big, and I'm actually kind of really excited. I don't know how big it really is or how much it tells us, but I do find it really interesting. And that is that you'll notice two things in particular. First things first, there is an old book and there's a new book. The book that we see in the Salvation trailer looks brand new. Then I go back to the Ambition trailer where we originally saw this book, and you'll notice that the book is extremely well worn. So this obviously indicates that there's a huge time skip between the Salvation trailer book scene and the Ambition trailer book scene, if we assume that these scenes both are in-game cinematics and not something made just for the trailer, which I think is somewhat safe to assume at this point. The other thing is that you'll notice that the symbol on the front is the same symbol that we saw in the music video that I said is most likely Cid's resistance faction symbol. It's like this torch-looking thing, and we see it on the wall at that grave scene, or what I thought might have been a grave scene. So that means that this book is intimately related to Cid's resistance faction, whether it is Cid's memoir, Cid's diary, maybe it's Vivian's memoir, or since Vivian's a historian, maybe she's keeping a record of things that happened while she's alive with this resistance faction. So in theory, this book, especially the older book, would contain all of the knowledge of what happens to Clive, right? If we assume that this book is being read in the future. So this, to me, implies a lot of time shenanigans, which I'll keep that in so you know where my brain originally went. But I think at this point, I think it's basically guaranteed that this story is going to have a future and past component more than we even initially thought. And that far into the future, there's going to be someone reading this book and recounting the tales of what we're doing. And I don't know, I find that really interesting. So hopefully you do too. Anyway, let's get back to the video. You'll hear what past Thalwig was thinking back when I originally recorded all my lines and looked at this trailer the first time. And this whole thing does remind me of Heavensward, as I said last time around, where the narration in Heavensward is actually done by Edmund, who is speaking in past tense as he writes into his memoirs. And that makes me wonder if this game will have a similar narrative device where, technically speaking, everything that happens in this game is actually happening in the past, and a future character might be the narrator speaking in past tense, describing events as they happened. And then we're on the final scene of the trailer, where we can clearly see that the Empire of Sanbreque's Mothercrystal Drake's Head is disappearing into the night. Based on the PAX event maps that we saw and the state of play maps, we knew that the Mothercrystal would be destroyed, so this doesn't surprise me. The thing is though, part of me wonders if they might be showing this one since it's the first one to be destroyed in the story, and so that's why they're showing it in the trailer. And again, this brings me back to the Crystalline Dominion or Empire of Sanbreque dilemma when we're thinking about that crystalline cave and Cid destroying that Mothercrystal, or at least attempting to destroy it. We know that the crystal has to be destroyed in the first half based on the PAX event, and I had assumed that maybe Barnabus destroyed it since he also seems to want to destroy the Mothercrystals. But right now, I think all signs are pointing towards us destroying the Mothercrystal, and pretty early on in the game too. I could be wrong and it's going against my gut, but that definitely seems to be the way things look right now, at least rationally speaking. Anyway, I think this video ended up being my longest trailer deep dive yet, and with only 3 minutes of runtime, I'm afraid maybe this video dragged a little bit, so I'm gonna end things here. I'll continue talking about Final Fantasy 16 up to and past release, so if you want to hear more from me, go ahead and subscribe. If you liked the video, leave a like, and if you have any questions about things I might have brushed over, feel free to leave a comment here. I read all the comments and generally respond. Beyond that though, this trailer I think was my favorite one so far, and while it might have shown a couple of new things, I didn't really feel like it was too spoilery for anyone who's been following these trailers, and I assume anyone watching this video has probably been watching my other videos, so it hopefully wasn't too spoilery for you. Of course, I think to the general population who aren't in as deep as we are, this trailer at first glance is super spoilery. But by the sounds of it, we'll be getting the demo here pretty soon. All signs seem to point to Sunday, June 11th, which is the pre-release event. And after the demo, June 22nd will be right around the corner. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video, and I hope you all have a good night. Thanks.